Queen Nefertiti's bust is the most famous and copied piece of ancient art in the world. But how much is really known about the woman herself? Mysteries surround much of her life, but she was possibly a ruler alongside her husband rather than simply a great royal wife, and perhaps even a pharaoh in her own right. Little is known of Nefertiti's life before marrying her husband Akhenaten. Akhenaten was the eldest surviving son of Amenhotep III, and on his father's death became pharaoh sometime around 1353 BCE. Nefertiti's parents are uncertain, although there are some guesses. A woman named Tay, who later became a great royal wife herself, was named as nurse of the great royal wife. This suggests she was the wet nurse of Nefertiti. Her husband, I, had the title God's father, and for some Egyptologists, this is a name often given to men whose daughters married the pharaoh. Based on this evidence, it has been suggested that Tay and I are in fact Nefertiti's mother and father, or at least father and stepmother. However, there is no evidence actually stating they are her parents, so it remains a mystery. I was also a brother of Akhenaten's mother, Queen T, so if I and Tay are Nefertiti's parents, her husband was also her cousin, not unusual in ancient Egypt's dynasties. The only family member that is known for certain is a sister named Mut Benret, as she appears alongside the royal family in several images. There is no certainty on Nefertiti's date of birth either, but based on the possible identification of a mummified body found that could be hers, she was possibly born around 1370 BCE. This means by the time she appears on images as Akhenaten's wife, she was probably in her early 20s. They were likely married just before or after Akhenaten took the throne as pharaoh, and their marriage seems to have started out fairly normally for a royal Egyptian family. At the beginning of Akhenaten's reign, he followed the well-established traditions that came before him. His name was originally Amenhotep IV, and several inscriptions survive that show him worshipping multiple gods, including Atum, Osiris, Hathor, Anubis, Ra, and the patron deity for Egypt, Nekhbet. Most importantly, the high priest of Amun, the highest ranking priest in Egypt at that time, was still active and in power. Akhenaten continued his father's building projects at Karnak, namely the precinct of Amun-Re. There are also images of Akhenaten worshipping Ra. In other words, Akhenaten never set out at the beginning of his reign to change the status quo of Egypt's hierarchy or how it worshipped. And at this point, Nefertiti was simply a great royal wife and would be expected to carry out the duties of a wife religiously and by having children to continue the pharaoh's bloodline. Early in Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Meritaten. They would go on to have 6 daughters. Both Nefertiti and Meritaten would be depicted on the walls of a temple dedicated to Nefertiti by her husband, the mansion of the Benben at Karnak, as well as Nefertiti's second daughter, Meketaten. This in itself would not be unusual, but there are signs that something was shifting in the personal ideas and beliefs of the royal couple. Firstly, Nefertiti appears more often in the scenes than her husband. In many of the scenes, she is a typical royal wife, appearing behind her husband and helping in his religious roles worshipping the gods. But she also appears in places someone might expect to see the pharaoh, such as smiting enemies. Her throne is also decorated in places with captive enemies, a prerogative of the pharaoh again. In other words, Nefertiti was already taking on more of a role alongside her husband. In the 4th year of Akhenaten's reign, the royal couple formally moved the capital to Akhetaten, modern Amarna, after centuries of Thebes being the capital of ancient Egypt. He chose a site halfway between Thebes and Memphis. The exact reasons for where the new city was placed are not completely clear, but a stele that marks part of the city boundaries gives some clues. The site was previously uninhabited, and the stele states that the site was good because it was not being the property of a god, nor being the property of a goddess, nor being the property of a ruler, nor being the property of a female ruler, nor being the property of any people able to lay claim to it. Another boundary stele that explained the founding of Akhenaten is sadly damaged, but parts that remain hint at why the capital was moved, stating that terrible things had been said in the pharaoh's presence, and that there had been offensive language against the Aten, the sun disk. This suggests that the pharaoh came into some conflict with the priesthood in Thebes. Conflict was likely with the rise of new religious ideas. The priests in ancient Egypt held extraordinary power, second only to the pharaoh in theory, advisors and manipulators behind the throne in reality. In the early 18th dynasty, especially under Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, getting the priests on side was a way to ensure holding on to the double crown of Egypt. As a result, large amounts of wealth were paid to the cult of Amun. By moving the capital, Akhenaten was making a statement. He was making a break with the god Amun and the cult's priests. They were no longer going to hold power, and were no longer going to get Egypt's wealth. It's likely, as many priests were members of noble families, that this did not go down well. But this was an even bigger break than anyone could have imagined. The new city was built quickly and was ready for the royal family to move into 4 years after building began. When Akhenaten and Nefertiti came to their new capital, they also did something unprecedented in ancient Egypt. They declared that the worship of the old gods would now be replaced with the worship of a single god, Aten, the sun disk. There is often some debate over whether Nefertiti and Akhenaten intended to create a monotheistic religion, or if they were merely selling the idea to people while allowing the worship of other gods. Nowhere does it explicitly say the old worship was no longer allowed, but the pharaoh and his great royal wife were the living conduit on earth that spoke with the gods, and now they had broken with them. But this had been foreshadowed in a speech Akhenaten made at the beginning of his second regnal year. He spoke to his people and stated that the old gods had disappeared and that only the sun gods still remained. He said, "The temples of the gods fallen to ruin. Their bodies do not endure. Behold, I, the king, am speaking so that I might inform you concerning the appearances of the gods. And I have watched as they have ceased their appearances one after the other. All of them have stopped, except the god who gave birth to himself. This god goes where he pleases and no one else knows his going." Religion was an integral part of ancient Egypt, and the royal couple were challenging the entire belief system of their country. Temples were erected across Egypt to Aten. Traditional temples went into increasingly smaller and darker rooms as someone ventured in, but these new temples were built very differently. They were large open-air structures with no roofs, designed to allow the life-giving sun in. A year after moving to the new capital and formally introducing the cult of Aten, Akhenaten officially changed his name from Amenhotep III, and Nefertiti became Neferuaten Nefertiti. These name changes show two unprecedented things. The first was the name change signifying the growing importance of the Aten cult and the embodiment of the Aten through the pharaoh and his wife. The second was that Nefertiti herself also had her name changed to show her significance. This was not simply a pharaoh establishing himself as a living aspect of the sun god, but also placing his great royal wife by his side as an equal, as the feminine aspect of the Aten. While there is little evidence suggesting it, many Egyptologists believe that around this time, Nefertiti became a co-ruler with her husband, rather than merely a consort. Something else also changed with the reign of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, how they were portrayed in images. Carvings show the royal couple sat with some of their daughters as small children. Nefertiti cradles one daughter on her lap, while another is at her shoulder, and Akhenaten cuddles his young daughter. Traditionally in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh and his family were never shown this way, showing affection to one another and doing so publicly. This is also shown in the royal tomb of Akhenaten. One of their daughters, Mekhetaten, died around year 14 of their reign, possibly of a plague that swept through Egypt at that time. Scenes around the tomb show the royal family openly mourning for their daughter, weeping and holding on to each other for support. Nefertiti and Akhenaten were truly saying to their country that they were different to what had come before, part of a new era for Egypt. But these revolutionary changes did not come without making enemies, and the previously powerful priests no doubt waited for their opportunity. This tension would have been increased when Akhenaten, attested in writings found from Amarna, came to believe he was the son of Aten. He also believed that Nefertiti was a living goddess, and that only he and Nefertiti could communicate with the Aten. In short, they didn't need any priests for their new religion. People were instead to directly worship Akhenaten and Nefertiti. But Egyptologists have found signs that people had not abandoned the old ways of worship, even right under the royal couple's noses in Amarna. Buried deep in the back of people's houses were statues and images of the old gods. But there were also publicly worn pendants and talismans showing images of Bes and Taweret, two household and childbirth related gods. This suggests that few really believed in the Aten the way Akhenaten and Nefertiti did. There are signs that Akhenaten tried to obliterate the old gods from around his 9th regnal year, especially Amun, by having their names and images removed and chipped out from inscriptions and carvings. This shows increasingly that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were possibly losing control over the religious sway of the people. Egyptologists in the past, using a series of clay tablets found in the new capital known as the Amarna letters, have often pointed to this part of Akhenaten's reign and described it as the beginning of the royal couple's downfall. But is this really the case? The letters found at Amarna reveal much about Egypt's foreign policy and show correspondence with vassal states, foreign rulers and military outposts. Early in his reign, Akhenaten was concerned with the growing Hittite Empire, but he relied more on information from his advisors and officials than the leaders of vassal states. Many states that were captured by the Hittite Empire wrote letters asking for help and troops, but it seems to appear that many of them were ignored. However, many other letters show that Akhenaten did respond to requests for men, chariots, horses, armies and archers, sending them to other vassal states, but those that were not on the furthest borders to modern-day Syria. In the past, the ignoring of requests for help in the letters was read as Akhenaten being a weak pharaoh. But looking more closely, it would appear that he understood he could not spread his forces too thinly, and so decided to maintain the core of Egypt, securing its protection while sacrificing vassal states on the outlying borders. Akhenaten also managed to avoid large-scale conflict with the Hittites, often choosing diplomacy over war. There is also no evidence of internal revolt within Egypt, something that would surely have happened if Akhenaten was ignoring affairs outside his internal rebuilding of religious policy. Around year 17 of Akhenaten's reign, the pharaoh died and he disappears from inscriptions. But what came after? And what happened to Nefertiti? Following Akhenaten's death, while the cult of Aten remained the main religious focus under his immediate successors, Smenkhare and Neferuaten, gradually Egypt returned to its previous polytheistic worship. Aten was replaced once more by Amun as the principal god. For a few years, worship of Aten and Amun occurred alongside each other. There is little evidence for the next pharaoh in the dynasty, Smenkhare, as his reign appears to have been less than 1 year when evidence shows he died. The few facts known of him are that he was married to Nefertiti and Akhenaten's daughter, Meritaten, who is shown as his great royal wife, and that he was probably a brother or possibly a son of Akhenaten with another wife. Some Egyptologists even theorize that he was never a full pharaoh at all, but possibly that he was simply a co-regent with Akhenaten. But the really interesting pharaoh is the one who comes after Smenkhare's disappearance from the record, Neferuaten. This was a female pharaoh, and while some theories speculate this was Meritaten after her husband's death, others suggest this female pharaoh was in fact Nefertiti. The argument against Meritaten being pharaoh comes from a box found in Tutankhamun's tomb that lists Akhenaten, Meritaten and Nefertiti as 3 separate individuals, explicitly naming Meritaten as Great Royal Wife. Nefertiti had already been renamed as Neferuaten Nefertiti while at Amarna, and an inscription on a private stele attests to Neferuaten being Nefertiti, as the words "effective for her husband" were carved over the single cartouche of Nefertiti's name. The idea of a female pharaoh wasn't new, but was unusual. A little over 100 years before, Hatshepsut had dressed herself as a man and took on the crown of Egypt as a strong female ruler. Some even theorized that, much as Hatshepsut did, Nefertiti took on a male name and clothing in order to maintain the position of pharaoh, becoming Smenkhare, killing off her male alter ego after her first regnal year, and continuing instead as Neferuaten. In this scenario, her daughter Meritaten would be a sort of spiritual, rather than actual great royal wife. It is possible that in light of Akhenaten's immediate successor dying, there may have been something of a regal crisis. Tutankhamun, most likely Akhenaten's son with another wife who wasn't Nefertiti, would have been even younger than the 9 years old he was when eventually taking the throne. Egypt was slowly returning to its old religious ways and still had threats to worry about at its borders. It's possible that instead of simply becoming a regent for her stepson, Nefertiti suggested herself as pharaoh. After all, she did have experience of ruling alongside her husband. Although Amarna seems to have remained the political and state capital for Egypt, there are signs that during the reign of Neferuaten, there was a deliberate return to the polytheistic worship of before the cult of Aten. Neferuaten's tomb was in Thebes, not part of the royal tomb of Akhenaten at Amarna, suggesting that an accord had been found with the priests of Amun. If this female pharaoh is Nefertiti, it means she quickly realised in the wake of her husband's death, and possibly with unseen events during Smenkhare's reign, that the people needed to return to the old gods. Getting the Amun priests back on side would go a long way in repairing a public image as well. Interestingly, around 80% of the funeral goods that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb were originally intended for the pharaoh Nefertiti, including his famous gold funerary mask. Many of the canopic jars in his tomb have female features, suggesting also that they were originally for Nefertiti. Different theories have been put forward for this, including that Nefertiti was deposed in a struggle for power, or simply that Tutankhamun died so suddenly that her funerary goods had to be repurposed. Whatever the truth, the evidence remains difficult to interpret thanks to the two successors after Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun further distanced himself from the cult of Aten by changing his name, which originally had been Tutankhaten, and officially reinstating the old gods and temples. The pharaoh after him was I, the man who has been proposed as Nefertiti's possible father, married to Te, Nefertiti's wet nurse, who became great royal wife. I had also been the chief advisor during Tutankhamun's reign, and he began the dismantling of the Akhenaten and Nefertiti period in his reign. Horemheb, the pharaoh that came after I, went further than this, separating himself entirely from the period of Aten by scratching out the names of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, dismantling their sun temples, and referring to the pharaoh Akhenaten in documents as the enemy or that criminal. While evidence shows that Egypt remained relatively stable during Akhenaten and Nefertiti's possible co-regency, it is clear that a rapid turnover of pharaohs after Akhenaten's death and threats from outside Egypt meant blaming it all on someone who came before. So Horemheb blamed all the current problems on the obvious candidate, the pharaoh and great royal wife who had changed everything. The wiping out of their names from history was finalized by the succeeding Ramesses dynasty, who wanted to further break from the tangled past of the late 18th dynasty. Although attempts were made to brush Akhenaten and Nefertiti out of history, fragments were found to piece them back together, not least the beautiful famous bust of Nefertiti now in the Neuss Museum in Berlin. It is clear from what survives that Nefertiti was not your average great royal wife. She was given unprecedented power alongside her husband's rule, stood alongside him as they tried to completely change Egypt's established traditions and worship, and may even have been a female pharaoh in her own right. While Nefertiti and her husband were rebels of ancient Egypt, she was also an example of the heights to which a royal woman and living goddess could rise. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.